Okay. All right. Good morning. Welcome to our 8 a.m. Zoom event with Admiral William Owens. Admiral Owens is the former Vice Chairman of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff. Our event today is moderated by Jodi Schneider, our club president. So before we begin, I just want to go over some of our upcoming events that we've got at the FCC. We've got Brian Stelter coming up on September 15th at 8 a.m. Brian is the chief media correspondent at CNN and author of the new book, Hoax, Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. That book is the product of a 2-year investigation into Fox News and its relationship with Donald Trump. And again, that's Tuesday, September 8th at 8 p.m. Hong Kong time. And we've also got on September 15th at 8 a.m., Professor Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel laureate in economics and professor at Columbia University, and the announcement for that event will be going out later today. So that's a new event that we just got, and we'll just be announcing today. So again, thank you for everybody who's joining us today. My name is Dan Strumpf. I'm a reporter at the Wall Street Journal and a correspondent governor here at the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong. Just want to remind everybody that our event today is live, and we are accepting questions as the event goes on, so please feel free to submit those questions. The best way to do that is at the email address question@fcchk.org. That's question singular at fcchk.org, and please feel free to sort of send those along as the event goes on, and we'll be sure to ask those of Admiral Owens. So again, it is my pleasure to introduce Admiral William Owens, former Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Admiral Owens is the author of the new book, U.S. China 2039, The Endgame. This book looks at 2 decades of foreign policy between the 2 superpowers and gives a view into the future relationship and what we should expect. Admiral Owens provides 12 policy recommendations in the book for that time period with the goal of avoiding future conflict and confrontation between the 2 powers, and with the hope that a more constructive relationship can emerge between what are the world's 2 largest economies. Our moderator today is Jodi Schneider, our club president and a senior editor at Bloomberg News here in Hong Kong. And with that, Jodi, I will turn it to you.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Dan. And thank you very much, Admiral Owens, for joining us from Seattle, Washington. It's very exciting to have you in the Zoom room. We've had a number of very successful Zoom events recently. We had Gary Kasparov last week. We had John Bolton a few weeks ago. We had Noam Chomsky. So it's really been an exciting series, and we're really pleased to have you today. I must say, I've been to Bismarck, North Dakota, where you grew up. I am also a Midwesterner, so it's fun to talk to another Midwesterner. We'll get to your book in China soon enough, but I wanted to ask you first, what has been like to serve in the U.S. Navy for 35 years, completing your tour as Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, be a commander through Desert Storm, and then return to civilian life? How has that been, or is running a company and doing all that somewhat similar to leadership in the military?
Well, Jodi, thank you for having me here today. It's nice to be back at the FCC. I'm very familiar with the FCC. My wife and I are Hong Kong residents. We lived there for 8 years and traveled a lot in China every week during my time there as I headed up a private equity company. So it's great to be with you all at the FCC. You know, in 35 years of Navy, I have a lot of Navy stories, so you want to be very careful how you ask those questions. You know, one of the great things about the military is that it is a great leadership test bed. And so you learn a lot about good leaders by watching them and bad leaders by watching them. And then you try to form yourself into what you think is going to be a good leader. And certainly that was my case. I learned so much in the military, and making the transition from being the second senior guy in the United States to being a businessman, you know, honestly, was I retired one day and I went to work the next morning in a large company and never looked back. My life is a blessing in every way, and I feel that way about it. And I've had some great experiences in business. None quite so satisfying, though, as being with some of the great men and women of the U.S. military. And so I miss that from that standpoint. I think in business, we try to build that comradeship, that togetherness. Sometimes we succeed to some extent, but usually we don't do it quite as well as I think the military does. So it was an easy transition for me. I've had a blessed second life. I retired 25 years ago. And so I don't feel much like a Navy guy anymore. I feel like Bill the businessman, not Bill the admiral. But it's been an easy transition for me. Thank you.
What can you tell us your highlight of your military career? What for you was the, you know, what is it that you remember most, what you're most proud of?
Oh, wow. I mean, it's so much, Jodi. I really, you know, I was in Vietnam as a young officer. Not an easy time for our country, and the profound lessons that I took away from that were very important. And then I was blessed to go off to college again. I was a Naval Academy guy, but I went off to Oxford for 3 years, and I think I was the only guy at Oxford who had served in the Vietnam War, and therefore I was not a popular guy, but it was good for me because I had to debate a lot with those who were on the other side of that equation. And even though I look back at it now and they were right, it was that was a changing time for me, that interface with a school like Oxford, to do that. But as you ask for the single most, I think it is when you get to a position where by yourself you can make some differences that change the lives of the people around you. So I was the captain of 3 nuclear submarines, and there, you know, you're out there in that time. It was the Cold War, and much of our time was spent under the North Pole. And we were there by ourselves. There was no help. And when you're the captain of one of those ships, it strikes you that everyone is depending on you. And I would say those were the highlights when I was with my own men, 160 of them at a time for 70 to 90 days at a time. And it was just us depending on each other and doing a pretty important mission, and finding myself as a result of that. But I had many other blessings with Desert Storm and my time on the Joint Chiefs later on with President Clinton as the president. And so there are many other stories to be told.
Well, good. Well, now I would like to talk about your book, which we have here. I will show it. Oops. Can you see it? It is called U.S. China U.S. 2039, the Endgame ? First, I'm interested in the title and why that year, because it was 20 years after you wrote it, 20 years in the future after you wrote it. And also in the book, you seem optimistic in your 12 policy recommendations that the world could avoid future conflict and confrontation, and that the U.S. and China could have a constructive relationship, which, given the couple months we've had of increasing tensions, seems very, very optimistic. So if you could talk a little bit about the book and your thesis there and the title.
Yeah, well, for all of our listeners, I feel passionately about China, United States. We can talk forever about this, but having been there a lot and having experienced China a lot, and of course, being deeply engaged in the United States, in the government and the military, I felt like I needed to try to tell a story of a pathway that could be taken to make for a peaceful relationship between the US and China. It's not playing out that way, but it was the intent of that book to spend about a year, and I did, with 5 or 6 other people every week, spending a lot of time trying to get a feeling for the way it was going to be in 20 years. And looking at all of the commentators and looking at all the authors and asking ourselves, what is this really going to look like in 20 years? And when you look at what could happen, it's terrible. And it's about our children. The book, as you know, Jodi, is dedicated to the young adults of China and the United States. Because this isn't about me, I'll be not around, but for them, this is such a critical issue, and the wrong steps being taken on the basis of political wishes, on the basis of lack of thought, on the basis of knowledge of what the future portends for us, doesn't look good either for the Chinese or for us. And so I thought it was important to tell a story that was a possible way with some specific recommendations, and it lists 12 specific recommendations for macro policy for the United States and China to undertake to preclude this worst case situation. As you know, Graham Allison's book, Thucydides' Trap, portends that the future will almost certainly, with the two largest countries in the world, result in conflict, and better man wins. And that is the path we could likely take as we see the various things going on between the US and China today. Now, I would just tell you that I watched this with the Soviet Union. I'm the only one probably on this Zoomcast that was old enough to be around while the Cold War was being generated. But in the United States and in the Soviet Union, there were lots of words about strength and how bad the other side was, and how the Russians were 10 feet tall. And it was the time of the military-industrial complex. President Eisenhower talked about the military-industrial complex, which, as he described it, was all of the congressmen who want to keep a strong military budget because they result in more jobs in their states, and it makes them seem more powerful. It's the defense companies, Lockheed, Boeing, Northrop, Raytheon, all wanting more money and having a huge lobby on K Street in Washington. And it's the admirals and generals who are all fighting for more money. That's how I got to be senior. I fought for more money effectively, and I became the senior guy in the US Navy. I look back on that and I say, is that really the way we want to go? That's going on in Washington right now, with being strong with the congressmen and the politics, the defense contractors, and the admirals and generals who are saying all the words, writing all the threats. And the same thing then starts to happen in China. And so we're seeing a lot of the similar words from China. And this will, if it is like anything like the Cold War, will continue down that pathway until something happens, and then we're into something that involves us country to country. And so I believe there are lots of ways to avoid that. I have spent a lot of time with the Chinese military. I do understand them fairly well, although no one could understand them completely. I do not salute the dictatorship elements of President Xi Jinping. The Chinese people are a different thing, and we need to remember that The Americans and the Chinese were great allies in World War II. And for those of you who have not been out to Chengdu or Chongqing, where General Claire Chennault's Flying Tigers and Stilwell existed side by side with the Chinese to take on the Japanese. It's a memory we all should have of how close we could be if we tried hard to make that happen. And there are many monuments out there. The party secretary out in the province will take you to many memorials in honor of the Americans who were there, proudly showing you that partnership. And I believe that that partnership could exist again. I would mention to you something that I did when I was in Hong Kong. I set up something called the Sanya Initiative. It was something that I got Tung Chi-Hua to help, and he did a lot. I put in money, he put in money, Hank Greenberg put in money, and we started something that brought 5 retired Chinese generals and 5 retired American generals, all the most senior ones, the 4 stars on both sides, together twice a year. And we spent 4 days talking about China, US, getting to know each other. I came to know their grandchildren. They came to know mine. We did it in China one year, the US the next year. And we talked seriously about what was going on. And we always concluded with a meeting with the senior active duty generals and admirals in China, the Central Military Command, and in the United States with the Joint Chiefs. That was widely accepted by Secretary Hillary Clinton, and it has been generally widely accepted by the senior members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the United States. As you can imagine, it's not widely accepted right now. And those on the far right, at least, would take great exception to the fact that this should ever go on with these kinds of meetings, especially, well, I'm not going to go there into the politics, but there are many who would object to this, both in the Senate and in the Congress and in the media. And so I believe it's especially important that some of us who feel very strongly about this take a very strong stand and try to do something about this most serious of issues if we care about our children at all. And I believe this is the time that we have to start down that pathway. So that book is published not so I can make a lot of money or become a famous author. If you want one, let me know and I'll send you one. But it was put on the market at $6 so it could sell a lot of copies to try to get the message out that there is another way to think about China-US. This is not in line with any of the books that I've seen published in the United States. It's the other side of the equation. And I thought with my background in the military, it might have more impact that way. I would just say one final thing in response to your question, Jodi, and that is that in the United States, we do not think long-term at all. I don't know of anyone in Washington, I spent many years in Washington, who thinks beyond the next 2 or 3 years. So the long-term vision is simply not there. We don't do it well, we don't implement it well. People say that's our democratic system, you can't do it. But I choose to believe there are ways and there are examples of things you can do for the long term. The Marshall Plan was one of those, for example. And so you can do some long-term planning and some thinking about the world in a long-term way. The Chinese, as you all know, do this extremely well. They can look 20 years in the future and people say, well, they've got a system so that they can do that, the one-party system, and they can make that happen. I believe that it's very important that we think long-term. And so that book was meant to say, this is how bad it could be in 2039. And we need to do something to preclude that from happening. And it gives some recommendations about that future.
Well, thank you for that. We actually have a question along those lines of what we were talking about in the different kind of planning systems that has come in. And how can the U.S., which changes its presidential leadership every 4 to 8 years, how can they, on policy issues, address China, whose foreign policy goals are set for decades? Isn't that a mismatch from the start? And how do you reconcile that?
Well, I think it takes enormous leadership. And personally, I don't think we've seen it in the US. I don't think we've seen it on either side of the aisle. We tend to want to tell the story about how great America can be and how great I am because I support power for America. We don't talk about how we could work together, Democrats and Republicans, to make a real difference. That happened, of course, during the Marshall Plan. It happened for Bretton Woods, the establishment of the United Nations and NATO. And there was a lot of cross the aisle work done to form a future for our country that was the basis of our prosperity today. I think we have to search for those great leaders. There are a few around who might be able to lead that kind of a togetherness, because I hate this. I hope all of you do as well. This partisan bickering in the Congress and in many other areas of our life, and we need some great uniters at all levels. I go back to my home state of North Dakota, and I find a lot of people who, like me, have not ever been out of that immediate geographical area, not ever. So how are they going to be prepared to plan for the long term in a way that reaches across the aisle? It's a real challenge. We need to have a few people step up to this, and God help us, I hope we can find some of those people to put some real plans in place that really move the needle. And as that book tries to say, there are some things you can do, big things that you can do that make a huge difference. I would tell you that I don't think the South China Sea, for example, is the same level of seriousness as Taiwan is. And so if that's true, and I believe it is, then maybe we need to focus a lot on what's going on with Taiwan. And the book makes some recommendations about Taiwan, because I believe it's the most significant single thing that goes on between the US and China that if it was resolved somehow, would result in a degree of cooperation between our countries. And I think we should stop name calling on the US side and on the Chinese side. And we should genuinely engage in diplomacy behind the scenes, not tweets, but diplomacy where we're really working on big picture things, not little picture things, but big picture things that matter. And the book gives a few recommendations about some of those things. So yes, I think there are some things that could be done where you might find over the next 10 years or 20 years, you might find policies that you could put in place that would matter if we realized how important this issue is to our children. And I think we owe it to them.
You mentioned the South China Sea and Taiwan. And, as a former member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, are you concerned about possible military action? I was going to ask in the South China Sea, but it seems like you think that that is less likely to happen. But we have heard, President Trump and the whole October surprise before an election theory that he might, resort to some kind of military action. And then, of course, sitting here in Hong Kong, there's always the speculation, as you note, that Taiwan is a particular concern right now, that there might be some action there. And obviously the U.S. sending over the Health and Human Services Secretary to Taiwan just a few weeks ago certainly was not something that China was pleased about. So tell us, from your military background, is this something you're worried about?
Well, of course, we should all be worried about what might happen in the South China Sea. A skirmish of some kind can turn into something that is much more serious. But again, in terms of the sheer seriousness of the way the government in Beijing takes the issue of Taiwan versus the issue of the South China Sea, I think they view Taiwan as much more important than the South China Sea. And I do believe there are solutions to the South China Sea. We can talk about that more. But I think that that one is not nearly the important issue like Taiwan is. And if we were able to have a meeting right now with the Central Military Command and with President Xi, my guess is you'd walk away knowing, if it was a sincere discussion, that it's all about Taiwan. It's about what happens in Taiwan. It's not about the size of our militaries. It's not about the South China Sea. It's not about North Korea. It's not about trade and tariffs. It's about Taiwan. And I think we need to take it very seriously and address it in meaningful ways. And again, I tried to make some recommendations about what one would do in Taiwan that would be, in my view, and the view of other senior people who were working on this with me, the best interests of the Taiwanese people and the Chinese. And so it's contentious. I don't think anyone is going to immediately stand and cheer, but standing and cheering about a solution to Taiwan is going to be very difficult, no matter what the solution is. And there are some pathways forward that might make a big difference.
Well, I'd love to hear you talk about those pathways and in particular what you would do if you were in your old job or a job like that, and also, or perhaps giving the president advice on what to do on Taiwan. But also, talk to us a little bit about, in your view, why Taiwan is the central issue. There's so many other issues on the table with the U.S. and China, and you're saying this is key. So why is this so key to China? And if you could, make some changes there, if you could try to bring some resolution to this, what would you do from the U.S. side?
Well, Taiwan is really viewed as an integral part of Greater China. Of course, you would say, well, the South China Sea is as well. I don't think it is in the same category as Taiwan. The nationalists do stand for democracy. We all salute that. I think that's great. They stand for a degree of everything we feel in democratic countries, and we should all salute that, and that's great. And they have much more democracy than I think we've ever had in Hong Kong. And we see that happening with the DPP and with the KMT parties as they do their political skirmishing in the battle for who wins the presidency of Taiwan. The Chinese have said in many, many ways, publicly and otherwise, if there is a declaration of independence in Taiwan, we will take military action to preclude that from happening. Those are serious words. You don't hear those kind of words about North Korea. You don't hear them about the South China Sea. You don't hear those words about any of the border skirmishes they have. You do hear it about Taiwan. They take it very seriously. It's what they think is one of the reasons I think it's a serious matter. And they view the Taiwanese people, the nationalists, as being people who are a part of Greater China. Now, I happen to think, and this is Bill Owens thinking, that if there was appropriate diplomacy between the United States and China behind the scenes, that there are solutions to be had. the Chinese are grieved that we continue to sell military arms to Taiwan. It's a huge issue for them. Here we are at the end of World War II. We agreed that there would be a peaceful solution that we would foster between China and Taiwan. We agreed to that. We've said it many times. And at the same time, we've said that we would stand with the Taiwanese in the event it was not a peaceful solution, that the Chinese came and took it back forcefully. So one China by force is not something we as a nation have stood for in the United States. That lines us up on the opposite sides of a battlefield. And what happens, I mean, the Chinese, if you've been watching in the Taiwan Straits, the Chinese have been doing a number of exercises there. America sends freedom of navigation test ships through the Taiwan Straits frequently, and we have reconnaissance flights over the area, and we are definitely focused on that area. And I have to say, the military-industrial complex likes very much standing strong for Taiwan in the Congress, selling military arms to Taiwan. That's billions of dollars that go into the pockets of large defense companies, and the generals and admirals who may not quite have absorbed in every case the grave importance of Taiwan continue to talk about how we will be there to defend. Now, I would just tell you that this has changed a lot since World War II. And so today, the ability of the West to stand by Taiwan and defend the island against an onslaught from China is very, very remote in its possibility of success. If the Chinese want to do this and have made up their mind, they'll do it, and our world will never be the same. It is the one thing the Chinese have told us they will do. It's the one thing that we know will happen. And I believe it's the one thing that's more important than anything else. So I think there are solutions that are good for everyone. They're not popular among all circles, but I think they are the kinds of things we need to talk about if it's true that that is the number one threat to peace between the United States and China. I think, friends, that if we had a solution, if we had a way forward, I think that we would find a wholly different relationship in every other area of cooperation with the Chinese and the Americans, and it would set a pathway for a much more safe and sane world just to solve that one problem for the benefit of the Taiwanese people, the Americans, and the Chinese. And so I didn't understand that. This is, that's my Siri phone over here talking to me.
Oh, Siri's with us. Great.
There you go. So I think that, you know, we need to look at these issues like this in the United States. What is the most important issue? Maybe Bill Owens is wrong. Maybe it's not Taiwan. Well, I'm glad to debate, but I don't even hear it mentioned in the context of this kind of a discussion and about the future of the relationship and precluding armed warfare of some kind with the United States and China, which would be a disaster for everyone, I think.
Okay, well, moving around the region to where we sit here in Hong Kong, we've heard recently, including from some recent FCC Zoom speakers like Noam Chomsky and Gary Kasparov, that Hong Kong has become kind of collateral damage in the fisticuffs between the US and China. And I'd like to hear your views on that. We have a question on this from Angel Kwan, a reporter with Apple Daily, that if it is a new Cold War between the US and China, how is Hong Kong affected? And is Hong Kong the two elephants, are out there, and Hong Kong's a grasshopper that gets crushed? And also, I'd like to hear your view too on the new national security law in Hong Kong and whether this could threaten Hong Kong's standing as an international business center.
Well, you have many in your office, Jodi, who are much more able to talk about this than I, but I'm happy to certainly give you my thoughts on this. I think Hong Kong has always needed a form of a national security law, like some of the things that are in the national security law that was forced on Hong Kong by the Chinese. It's too bad it had to happen that way. And I think from the West standpoint, I would pray that a year from now, we will not see as many violations we will not see as many issues of China interfering in Hong Kong as much of the Western press would have us believe. That it is in China's best interest to have a Hong Kong that is very much like it was before. I think Hong Kong, pardon me for talking about another place when I'm an American here in Seattle, Washington, but I believe Hong Kong is a wonderful place for a mixing pot, for a hub of Asia, for a hub of the world. The Chinese certainly know this. Some very smart Chinese, Minister Liu He, who did the negotiations with Washington and with President Trump, certainly understands the great importance of Hong Kong in the international trade and monetary systems. And I couldn't imagine that they would want to do anything that looks anything like a Tiananmen Square or an involvement that seems too much. And I think Western businessmen really need and want to be there. It's a great place, but it's a great place also because of commerce, because of the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, because of the safety and security there. And I think American companies have tended to stay. And I noticed that the Hang Seng is not doing too badly, just like the New York Stock Exchange. So, you know, there is apparently an optimism in the business community. I also have a feeling that maybe some of the issues of Hong Kong are other issues that we don't talk about. It's not about extradition. It's not about an extradition treaty. Maybe it's something like rich versus poor. Maybe it's less democracy and some other form of let's fix some of these issues that have caused people to not be able to buy homes or a variety of other issues. But I have a feeling that a year from now, China is going to want it to be pretty much the way it was before. I would hope that they won't interfere that much. And I would hope that the people of Hong Kong are safe and secure in that feeling, and that the West is starting to feel again friendly to Hong Kong and the way the government is operating as it did for many, many years. So maybe that's wishful thinking, Jodi, but my view is that 12 months from now, when I hope you invite me back, we'll be able to say, look how smart he was 12 months ago.
Well, that would be, I would very much enjoy having you here a year from now. But I do wonder, isn't some of this international business community standing, which of course, you know, Hong Kong has had, isn't some of that at risk if freedoms, basic freedoms like freedom of the press, freedom of expression, some of the independent judiciary, you know, having an independent judiciary here, if some of that is at risk, doesn't the, you know, isn't the whole ability of the international, of Hong Kong to be an international business center somewhat at risk?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is to some extent. That is absolutely true. And it's obvious that as Americans, we would like every degree of freedom that's possible for Hong Kong. We all know the terms under which Hong Kong was turned over from the Brits to the Chinese, and that did not include a lot of democracy in it, but it did include a freedom of the press, the justice systems, the kinds of things that make Hong Kong really work. And, it's not Singapore, it's a better place than Singapore, in my view. And I think the Chinese want it to stay that way. And I can't believe that the Chinese are going to do something that's going to upset that great situation they have in a Hong Kong that seems to be thriving even now, well managed in terms of the day-to-day safety and medical care of its citizens. And I can't imagine that the Chinese want to do anything that's going to upset that balance. I'm sure many of you have different views. And again, I'm not bent on how kind the Chinese administration is, but I do think that from a standpoint of practicality, I hope, will see a degree of normalcy like we had a year ago in Hong Kong.
I'd like to move back to the U.S. a little bit. Here's a question from Christopher Page, and it works with a question I have about whether, depending on the outcome of the U.S. election, let's say that Joe Biden does win in November, will the direction of China-U.S. relations remain the same? This kind of, tough rhetoric, calling out China on a number of issues, including things like national security threats, with the U.S. claiming national security threats with technology, other issues involving human rights, those kinds of things. Do you think that is something that the Biden administration would continue as the Trump administration has? Have we kind of gone down that decoupling route a bit? Or would they readjust? Or do we wait until 2024? What is your view on, have things changed in a significant way so that really we will not be back to what we would have been, what we had in previous administrations, including, the one you closely worked with, the Clinton administration?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is, who knows, I guess, is the answer to that. But I think more important than who is the vice president is the fact of who is the cabinet. And I think we really need to look at who's the Secretary of State, who is the Secretary of Defense, who's the National Security Advisor, and who are those senior people who are going to be setting the policy. I think in the United States today, it's very difficult right now to do a radical withdrawal from the fact that, you all know the lines. China has stolen our intellectual property. They've taken our jobs. They've charged us exorbitant tariffs, and we just stand by and wait. The United States is a wonderful country filled with exactly the right kind of resources to see through this. And I think that the people of America, in addition to seeing a lot of cross the aisle cooperation, I think that's what we want more than anything else in the US, is we want Democrats and Republicans to cross the aisle and do the best things for our country and for international relations. I think there are two issues there. One is China-US, and the other is the huge deficit and the collapse of the dollar, possibly, if we continue down this pathway. So I hope that across the aisle, we can find genuine discussion about these kinds of things. We've seen it in the past. We've seen it in the past, even after times when we were terribly partisan, and we've come together. And I would hope that in the United States, there will be some of those. I see some senators and congressmen who have that in them. And so just as we had great people in the past, Sam Nunn, Dick Lugar, Dick Gephardt. I mean, these people crossed the aisle and they did wonderful things for our country. And I hope that we can find a way to do that under, I'd love it in either administration. But I think if there is, as you asked the question, if there is a Biden administration, I would hope that cabinet would look to real diplomacy, not not in the open. Let's make a few social media statements and shut off the doors for real diplomacy to take place. And then back to the cabinet, who are the diplomats going to be who go to do the kinds of bidding that we need to have to put in place the right kind of policies? And I would suggest some of those policies I've tried to put in chapter 4 of that book. And I think that it's possible, but it's going to take a while. It's not going to happen in the first months after a Biden election. And I'm not saying I'm cheering here for Biden. I mean, President Trump has done a number of good things, but in general, the world is not as global as it was. And I feel like that's one of the failings of the Trump administration is to isolate itself from NATO, from Europe, from our partners around the world, and from engagement with China and India to do all we can for the people of the world. That's who we are in America. We want that to happen. And sometimes it takes a while for free trade to have its impact so that we can see it's really good for our pockets also. But if there's a vision there across the aisle, I think we can make something happen. And I know a number of people who are working hard to do exactly that, Republicans and Democrats, in the event of a change in leadership in the country.
I wanted to ask another question about the election, since we're discussing that. There has been some growing concern and speculation in Washington that, and based on comments President Trump has made about the upcoming election, that even if President Trump was to lose the election, and especially if the outcome was contested, like in 2000, that he could simply refuse to leave office. Given your military background and your service with the Joint Chiefs, what would be the role of the military in such a situation? Could you see a situation in which there could be having to be made a decision to actually remove the president from office, perhaps by force, from the White House?
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the nice things about being out of the military is that you can even talk about that.
Right, exactly.
But as you heard from General Milley the other day, who made a public statement on that very topic, saying that the United States military is not a partisan organization, and it's not. I'm sure the Joint Chiefs all feel that way, that it is there to serve the nation. It's not a Trump military, it's not a Biden military, it's a U.S. military, and that it will be very difficult to get them to do anything that is viewed as political. So I pray that what you suggest doesn't happen. If it does, I think we have to react in the courts, in the Electoral College, in the various fora of the Congress to try to resolve whatever the issues are. And if President Trump or President Biden said, I simply don't accept the results, then I guess that would require an early meeting of the Supreme Court to say, this is the result. And so I don't know. We've never faced this, but I will say that many of us in the United States are painfully aware of how fragile the Constitution and our democracy is when you think about some of the things that might happen and which might require this kind of activity. Of course, the counting of the ballots in the Gore-Bush election was handled well, and I think Al Gore stepped aside gracefully to let the system get on with itself after a ruling by the court. And I would hope that something like that's going to happen. There would be huge pressure placed on whoever was on the side of resisting coming out of office. And I don't believe that will be from the U.S. military, who will assist whoever that is leaving the office or coming into office. So I can't imagine that happening in the United States, but we'll have to wait and see. And most importantly, I'm involved in a little activity in the United States to foster, on behalf of Republican and Democratic congressmen, a series of important business people and a number of us retired military who are standing for a safe and fair election. And that has all kinds of meanings we can talk about, but there is a paper that all of us have undertaken to look at and approve, and it's bipartisan, it's across the aisle, it's military, business, and political, to push the states to do all we can to have a safe and fair democratic process. So I think this is another one. Maybe we have another meeting in December, and then we can talk about what happened. How great will that be?
Yeah, well, I certainly hope that you're right, that it does not come to the military, who of course are, they swear to uphold the Constitution as well. So I want to change topics a little bit as we have our last few minutes of this chat. You worked quite closely with Huawei during your time at Amerilink, the consultancy you founded that partnered with Huawei to bid for the contract to upgrade Sprint's mobile network. Did you ever get the impression that Huawei was somehow controlled or owned by the Chinese government, which is the claim the U.S. makes and President Trump has made, and that the Trump administration has used to try to bar Huawei from the U.S. and pressure other countries? Is that something you saw, or is that just heated rhetoric, given these tensions that have increased?
Well, remember where I came from after the military. I was the CEO of a couple of companies. One of them was Nortel, Fortune 100 company, much larger than Huawei. Nortel provided the telecoms networks for China in many parts of China and the world. And so Nortel was truly the size, not in total billions of dollars, but in influence in the world of telecoms networks, 4G at the time, high bandwidth fiber. You want me to talk a little technology, I can talk technology, but I'm not going to do that. And Nortel was in that position. There was a time when Ren Zhengfei and I were quite close, and I believed, and it's another contentious topic, that if we somehow had a coming together of Nortel and Huawei as a partnership of some kind, that we would be able to come to grips with the challenges of intellectual property theft, of cyber attacks together, because cyber attacks are something we don't have time to talk about, I'm sure, here today, but it's very, very possible in a new world. And if Huawei and Nortel had had some relationship like that, we could have done something profound. We, on the Nortel side, worked with the U.S. government to talk about this, and I'm not going to talk about that more. But it was an attempt to try to do something that recognized Huawei's importance in China. I never saw on the Huawei side a significant Chinese government influence. I never saw it. There is not, at least what Huawei will tell us, there is not government ownership. On the other hand, Jodi, these kind of companies, Nortel, Huawei, Boeing, Lockheed, you can be sure that the governments are going to care a lot about what you do. And they do care a lot about what you do. And so I have no doubt that the government of China has a significant amount of influence over Huawei, just like the U.S. government has control over, not control, but certainly a lot of influence over many of the strategic, very large companies in the United States. So how do we find a meeting point that's good and secures our interests in the United States? It was to try to find a way to do something together. And when it was not possible to do that, and in later years, I have no relationship with Huawei, but at the time, the effort was meant to be in the best interests of the world and the United States in finding ways to work with, understand, and know what was going on there. And of course, they would learn something about what was going on with us as well. But again, Americans are very strong. We're very innovative, and we, I thought, could handle that well. And so did many other people in the United States. And Huawei, as you know, sold many, many products into the United States for years, especially rural telecoms companies. A lot of networks were sold into the United States. And that was a time we seem to have forgotten now, but it was very real that Huawei was doing a lot of that. So it's another one of those topics where you can talk for the next 2 hours about this, but this was an effort on my part to do the best I could for the United States and for generally the relationship between China and the U.S. And of course, today it's simply none of that is happening.
Right. A quick follow-up on that from my colleague Dan here, Dan Strump with the Wall Street Journal, who asked who do you think is winning the 5G race, U.S. or China? Obviously, there's been a lot of talk by U.S. blocking Huawei that it will will hurt the development of 5G. But who do you think is winning at this point, if you had to say?
Well, I'll come back to that in a second. But I think a better question, Dan, is who's winning the Wi-Fi race? No one seems to care about Wi-Fi, and yet Wi-Fi around the world accounts for trillions of dollars of revenue, much more access to the internet than 5G or 4G or 3G. And no one seems to want to talk about that. And yet Wi-Fi is exploding in its significance in the world. And some people think, I tend to be one of them, that Wi-Fi and the internet is like water. We need it for all kinds of reasons, just like we need water and food. And so getting the internet out to people for telemedicine, for distance learning, for better lives is a very important element. And yet no one seems to talk about Wi-Fi 5, Wi-Fi 6, Wi-Fi 6E, Wi-Fi 7. How boring. We'd rather talk about 5G. So you want to talk about 5G? When I was CEO of Nortel, we used to be the king of 4G. And I would say, let's see if we can make 2G work better around the world for the good of everyone in the world, rather than this focus on 4G. And many of you in the United States, if you try your cell phone on the streets of New York City or San Francisco, you do not get a 4G signal. It's not there. There's not enough bandwidth. So here we are talking about 5G, and AT&T and Verizon and T-Mobile have put tens of billions of dollars into licensing and antennas and infrastructure. And I'll bet for this audience, I'll bet 10 years from now, you won't get 5G on the streets of my little suburb of Seattle, Kirkland, in 10 years. So
I didn't understand that.
Siri has something to say about that.
Siri disagrees. That's fun.
I don't know how to turn Siri off. I should have done that. Anyway, Dan, you know, who's going to win the 5G race? I think Huawei is very strong. They're not going to sell into the United States, at least anytime soon. The United States, as you know, we don't have any companies that do 5G. There isn't anybody here, not Cisco, not Qualcomm. Who does 5G? Ericsson and Nokia. And so where is their equipment made? A lot of it's made in China. So we buy 5G systems from Ericsson and Nokia in the United States. Those are the providers of 5G in the United States. And I think that they do have some advances. I think it's good. It's probably as good as Huawei's 5G, if that's what you mean by winning. But I think that, you know, this topic is deserving of a couple of hours of discussion. So I think it's a tie, if that's what you want. And then we should talk about things that really matter, like how do we get Wi-Fi to the masses for real? And it's possible. It's just that we don't try very hard to do that, and yet it's an explosion of the internet in the world for the good of families around the world.
Well, thank you. And we don't have, we probably could talk for hours, but we are at the end here, but I did want to ask one final question, which we're asking of all our Zoom guests this summer. What are you reading? What is your summer book recommendation besides your own, which I'll show again. Here it is. What else would you recommend?
I just read that over and over, you know. No. I read Bob Zelek's book. He just published a book on international relations. I think that's extremely good. And you know, I tend to look for the media that tells me the real stories, and so I like the South China Morning Post a lot. I read it every morning in the app. I read Al Jazeera, and I read a lot of business books about innovation. There's one favorite one I have, which is, it's not, when you're starting a business, it's not the what, it's the who. It's the people, the few people who have the imagination and are going to make it happen. And yet we tend to think it's, well, I'm going to start this product X and I'm going to go out and hire a bunch of people and then I'm going to make it and sell it. No, it's the vision and the imagination of the who's are involved. So so I do a lot of reading of management books.
Great. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And we would like to invite you to join us at the FCC. We hope in person in the future when we can all travel again. So consider that an open invitation. And we thank you for your time.
It's very nice to be with you all. I wish I was back in Hong Kong if you let Americans come in with our virus problems. But it's nice being online with all of you. And thank you very much for this nice invitation to talk to you. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you all for watching. And this will be on YouTube and on the FCC website very soon. Thank you.